It's only in a crisis that you find out who your real friends are. Yeah, they're not the ones who friend you on Facebook or whatever other social media you're using. And a crisis teaches you more about you and your relationships than it does about the crisis itself. People who really have got strong bonds can come together to help one another in a crisis, whereas peoples whose bonds are much looser often fall apart and have arguments about what the real problem is, who's to blame, and so on. Jean Monnet famously stated that Europe will be forged in a crisis. If that's the case, I have to say that the European Union has consistently been found wanting. It can agree, it can become very friendly when it comes to regulating the chemicals in your bath time rubber duck. But when there's a serious problem, everybody goes their own way. And we've heard today already that in the financial crisis, first Ireland moved to protect its currency, but then Germany, Denmark, Greece, Spain, the EU was nowhere to be seen. In COVID, France and Germany banned the export of personal protective equipment and reverted to the nation state. The European Union followed and had to suspend state aid rules because nation states were already breaching all the codes. And of course now with the war in Ukraine, you can see different interests manifesting themselves. Slow responses from some members may be compromised. So why is that? I think if we take our starting point as the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we can see how that led to, not immediately, but in the ensuing years, to a gradual erosion of the political division, not just in Europe, but right across the world, the division that had shaped the Western world between a political left and a political right. Now there was no left, and the right had to wake up to who they were going to blame for all their problems for the first time in 50 years. There was a crisis of political engagement that ensued, maybe more so, as Monica has pointed out, in Western Europe than further east. If you look at the voting patterns at the last French presidential election, there were 28% of no votes in the second round. 41% no vote amongst the 18 to 24 age group. Now you might say it's not a real vote between Macron and Le Pen, but nevertheless, it's an important signifier, and you can see that again and again and again across most Western European democracies. We also see that increasingly votes appear to be split, almost 50-50, over most issues. It's not just Brexit, it's not just Trump, it's not just the US midterms, but on almost every issue there's a cultural schism emerging across Europe. But I think most importantly of all, the lesson for me is that those who are politically active, and by that I mean do more than just turn up and put their cross on a piece of paper, those who are politically active are a minority of society. And that means that minorities determine the polis for the majority. So you've got a disengagement of the vast majority of the people of Europe, which creates a legitimacy crisis for the state. And it doesn't just have political or economic consequences. The Cold War framework shaped people's identities. You see a social unraveling of old affiliations and allegiances, leading to a new politics based around identity, a pursuit of recognition rather than redistribution of resources. So at the same time, we also know from Robert Putnam's work at Harvard that people have become socially disconnected. They're politically disengaged, but increasingly socially disconnected. In his book, Bowling Alone, Putnam looks at the breakup of all of the social networks that hold communities together, from families, neighborhoods, Boy Scouts, all sorts of other networks that he examines. So you have a population who are politically disengaged, socially disconnected, and worst of all, now comes a political project that also dismisses them. After the war, nationalism was understandably discredited. People pursued supranational projects like the European Union, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and subnational politics through civil society groups, more preferentially maybe than the national ones. But the European Union, as opposed to the European community, emerged in the early 90s. It came with this decline of popular democracy, which I've already alluded to. It saw political contestation replaced by apolitical administration. Christopher Bickerton, who is a professor of modern European politics at Cambridge, has written one of the best books on this, called European Union Integration from Nation State to Member State. And he asks you to think, what's the difference between a nation and a member? And the point he makes is, if you take the old Abraham Lincoln version that a nation is government of the people, for the people, by the people are central to that concept. It reflects an active role and loyalty from a lived relationship with your nation. Whereas when you subsume this to becoming a member of a political club, what you find is that the elites very soon lose their relationship to the people who authorize them and begin to derive their authority and power from membership of the club. They are more comfortable in elite committees and commissions, talking to the judiciary and other elected bodies, than they are listening to you on a cold Thursday night or whenever it is in November about what your political concerns are. People become problems for them that need to be managed rather than the source of their authority. And it creates a disconnect between the values of the elites and the values of the people. You see that across a range of literatures. You can look at Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, reflecting on this in the United States of America, Christophe Guillet's La France périphérique, which also makes the same point in France, and David Goodhart's Road to Somewhere. Elites are connected, mobile, and have a sense that they shape their own destiny, whereas the people, or as became known during the COVID crisis, essential workers, are more reliant on family, tradition, and community. Elite concerns are not the same as the people's concerns. The elites are concerned about net zero, the far right, internet controls, and self-identification. Ordinary people want to keep their job, are worried about healthcare, the education of their children, and the cohesion of their community. So clearly there's a cultural disconnect that has sidelined everybody. There's an erosion both of national sovereignty and personal sovereignty. So when Vera Jourova, the Vice President for Values and Transparency, asserted, "This is what Europe is about, and this is what we stand for," as she launched the European Commission's LGBTIQ strategy, she then made clear that this would be enforced by law. But I have to tell Vera, this confuses power with authority. Morality cannot be legally enforced. Real values emerge organically over time through the informal relationships that people forge with one another. They take generations to build, but they can be destroyed quite quickly. And rules and regulations can never compensate for these. I want to close by touching on what happens if we lose sight of this in the context of war, as we find ourselves in now. Debate over long-term goals in security have been replaced by risk management and a narrow focus on options and procedures. This creates confusion about what we fight for. If you look at the war in Afghanistan, initially we were told it was to get rid of the Taliban. Then it was to bring democracy to Afghanistan. Then it became to liberate women. Then it became a war on opium. There were so many conflicting aims that the people on the ground no longer knew what their mission was. I used to teach in the United Kingdom's Senior Defence College, and I can tell you that soldiers always moan about being sent to war. They moan about their kit that doesn't fit, their guns that don't fire in the sand. But when the action starts, the moaning stops. And the key to winning all wars is spirit, not kit. As the Americans learnt in Vietnam, it's the spirit that is here that matters far more than the equipment that you have and the procedures and the codes and the rules that you follow. You have to have a sense of belief, a sense of duty, and a sense of loyalty. Men without a mission make poor soldiers. It can't be compensated for by processes, analyses, or planning. You fight because you believe that there is something worth fighting for. And, as Clausewitz understood, you need support from those at home in terms of those values. When did you last debate what you were for as a society, as opposed to what you are against? We failed in Afghanistan because you have to win the argument here first. Who are we? What do we stand for? Where are we heading? War is unpredictable and transformative. It's not an arena for committees and risk management. If the elites fear risk and change, and the people are disconnected or have been dismissed, we cannot challenge anything, still less resolve conflict. Fortunately, the Ukrainian people have taught us all a lesson. They show what ordinary people are really about and what they can really achieve. Professors and ballerinas have left their job to fight on the war front. Don't know how many of you would willingly do the same. But for people to do that, they need to know what they believe in and have a sense of what they belong to. If we fail to provide that to our young people, they're going to look somewhere else. And as John Stuart Mill, that great Enlightenment philosopher, knew, a state that dwarfs its men will find that with small men, no great thing can be achieved. We need to engage and inspire people, and that, I hope, is what MCC Brussels has set out to do. Thank you.